panel, who I'm sure I'm known to most of you, but let me start from the far end. There's Rod Aldridge, who was the founder of Capita, who's one of the biggest players in this market over the years. Caroline Downs, Chief Executive of the LGA and former Chief Executive of Shropshire Council. Helen Bailey, who's a former Director of Public Service at the Treasury and a former Chief Executive of Islington Council. And Tony Travers, who is Director of London Group at the London School of Economics, but kind of Mr. Local Government guru all round. So what we're going to do to start with is Tony and then Helen will spend 5 minutes or so talking about the forces for change that led to all this. And then we'll have Rod and Caroline talking about some of the successes and failures on the way. And then we'll talk about lessons that might be learned from this and where it might go, at which point I hope to involve many of you if you haven't done so already. So Tony, would you like to start?
Okay, Nick, and thank you very much, whoever invited me, for Institute for Government for inviting me. It's just worth putting this issue, I think, against the background of the growth in local government since the Second World War. Nick just referred glancingly to this. Local government, I wouldn't say before that, was not involved in public welfare provision, but only fleetingly so. Obviously, hospitals had grown up to some extent within local government. There was a limited amount of social housing, limited amount of social care. But it was after the Second World War, with the evolution of the welfare state, that local government grew very substantially, and with it, the scale of the services it was delivering. So it was going beyond public goods, but way beyond that now into being a major deliverer of welfare. Not the health service, but many other parts of what became the welfare state. And of course, with that, inevitably, or not so necessarily inevitably, but as it turned out, of course, very powerful public sector unions, both within local government and, of course, until Mrs. Thatcher's government in the private sector as well. So a major growth in local government after the Second World War, and indeed a growth of central government funding to match that. But the beginning of the forces for change, I think you'd have to argue, was the industrial unrest of the 60s and 70s, producing, as it did, significant trades union militancy, which in turn, one way or another, created Mrs. Thatcher. Those of you who watched the first part of Dominic Sandbrook's programme on the 1970s last night on BBC Two will have seen some of this beginning to be made clear. But in many ways, Labour's failure to modernise union and industrial relations in the 60s and 70s paved the way for Mrs. Thatcher. And it was Mrs. Thatcher as Prime Minister in the early 80s who set about the radical overhaul of public expenditure, or cutting public expenditure, reducing local government spending via very complex means, but in particular, in the Local Government Planning and Land Act of 1980, introducing compulsory competitive tendering for direct labour departments. I think if you're looking for a single beginning point for the world we're about to discuss, of course local government used the private sector before that on contract to deliver many things. But I think this was where I would probably put the beginning point of the modern world. This was very much part of Mrs. Thatcher's view of the way industrial relations and indeed local government needed to be reformed. Mrs. Thatcher was no great friend of local government, and I think it's fair to say no great friend of the trade unions. This particular reform, CCT, helped attack both at once. And I think from then on, we see the extension in the Thatcher government, not only of this idea, but also of quasi-markets within the public sector, particularly at the end of the 80s and into the 90s, the major government attempting to build on some elements of Mrs. Thatcher's creations, tried to extend CCT into white-collar parts of local government. And beyond that, we've seen subsequently the idea of privately provided or privately tendered services grow in strength. All the way through the Labour years, the Labour government, when it took office in 1997, had a particular aversion, it would appear, to publicly managed large contracts, particularly in local government and the NHS, evolving an enormous amount of private sector activity through PFIs and PPPs, taking another step in the direction of using the private sector or privately contracted services in order to allow the public sector to deliver services it was in turn seeking to provide. I think it's fair to say that at all points one should not ignore, forgetting Mrs. Thatcher and the Labour government's distaste for public sector or some public sector controlled investment, it's worth pointing to the fact that in Britain at any point there is a desire to have European, particularly Scandinavian scale public services with America's taxes. And that pressure at all points, that is the desire to deliver £110 worth of services for £90, is a continuous pressure on all parts of the public sector, particularly local government, and therefore the private sector, or partnerships with the private sector, offering ways of reducing costs in order to allow service levels indeed to be delivered at more than the taxpayer appears willing to fund, is another element in this long story. So it can't all be put down to Mrs. Thatcher and the early 1980s, I think it's fair to say. Obstacles to the evolution of this market, well, at any point, and for reasons that barely need explaining, trades unions, not always of course, but in many cases. The Labour Party originally was very unenthusiastic about CCT, but actually over time became a major supporter of the idea of the private sector delivering public services and shifted its positions profoundly, particularly after the invention of New Labour in 1994, 5, 6. Another obstacle is probably some inertia within local government. Local government, of course, has always been more efficient, more effective than national government. You only have to look at National Audit Office reports to see how that must be true. But even aiming off for that, local government itself can only move at a certain pace, except when there are radical changes, either brought by legislation or, as today, by the unprecedented, certainly since 1945, cuts to its grant support and therefore its expenditure, which are creating pressures to find any way of delivering £110, well actually £100 worth of services for £75 as it now is, and that pressure is simply going to grow over the next 5 or 6 years. So that's just really a canter through, I think, Nick, how all of this started, what were indeed the forces for change. So I can just summarise. The forces for change were, in no particular order, Mrs. Thatcher, the Labour government after 1997, and the continuing profound desire to deliver higher levels of service in local government than the taxpayer was ever quite willing to fund.
Great. Thank you very much. Helen.
Well, thank you, Nick, and as ever, it's a privilege and a challenge to follow Tony, because what is there left to say? So I wanted to take a slightly different turn on this and say, actually, in my lifetime in local government, which started working for the GLC in, I won't tell you when, you can work out the maths, it was abolished in 86, so that's how old I am. I've seen a huge revolution in the way that local authorities deliver services, but actually there are some consistent themes in the way we think about this conundrum, and I sort of wanted to share them with you. Having seen them both as somebody who started off being employed in local government, became a management consultant, went back to a local authority, and I'm still employed by the Treasury, running a small organisation designed to help local public services manage their relationships with the private sector better, called Local Partnerships, more available later if you see me afterwards. And it seems to me that the first driver of all of this is the complexity of our public policy aims around local government itself. We never just want to do one thing. I mean, Tony's absolutely right. We do want a huge volume of value of service for as little money as we can get away with spending. But we also have aims about the way in which we think the world should be, which are projected onto those services, which have driven the creation of markets and the marketisation of public services. So, for instance, a notion that big monopolies in the public sector were wrong was, I think, very prevalent, and Tony's talked about it being prevalent amongst thinkers in the Labour Party as well as, I think, in Mrs. Thatcher's Conservative government. A notion that somehow there is the right balance between a local public services as an employer and a generator of economic benefit through its activities and its own staff, and a generator of local and national employment through letting contracts and through encouraging firms like Rods and others to develop. And we've never taken an entirely one view, and we've always had slightly different views centrally and nationally. So first issue for me is that very complexity. The second issue, I think, is that price, cost, value for money issue, which in some ways doesn't need talking about at the moment because we're all very, very conscious. I was in the Treasury in the last comprehensive spending review. We took 28% on average out of local authority spending, and if you listen to what colleagues who are still there are saying, there is another big chunk to be bitten out of local authority funding, another funding in the next CSR, whenever that is, but probably sooner than we'd all like. So there is a huge imperative to get the costs down. But then we get into that debate about what constitutes value for money. And alongside all of the things on this rather wonderful, gloriously technicolor sheet, we've had hundreds and hundreds of ways of trying to justify and to talk about what constitutes a value for money in a public service. Some of which is about benchmarking it against equivalents in the private sector, but where that equivalence, I would say, is always questioned by our people who seem to be doing the same thing, doing exactly the same thing with the same levels of accountability and the same levels of political oversight and scrutiny. And the answer in some cases is yes, and in some cases is no, but it's a much more nuanced debate than it first seems. And certainly we moved from perhaps relatively crude models of CCT and market testing into things like best value indicators. And Nick and I, who have a shared past in Islington, I think we'll both remember with horror looking at 1,500 best value indicators from services through to street cleaning and rat catching right the way through to management of care homes. And actually, you know, what is the point? I mean, you just have to say 1,500 best value indicators to realise there's no point. So there is something there about what is the value that we are trying to get for our money, and how when we reduce that value, when we reduce that money, we also focus on what it is that is really valuable. And I think, you know, if we had the time, and you told me to keep to 5 minutes, and I shall try, there is a whole conversation about expectations and rationing that sits behind that we probably don't have time to go into today. But one of the big issues for local government has been, how do you talk about universal services and then not always find yourselves in a position to deliver a service universally to everybody? We had under the last government the really rather interesting concept of targeted universalism, which I never quite got, but it was kind of quite interesting. Then I think the next big issue is, for me, one about confidence. There is a huge lack of confidence, I think, in the public sector generally about its ability to deliver things to a high quality and a high standard. That's not universal, but there is more of it than there should be. And that lack of confidence, I think, has pervaded the national-local debate in some very interesting ways. So Tony again talked about the pivotal impact of Mrs. Thatcher, whose government did demonstrate a huge confidence that they were going to reform public services and turn them into things that were better value for money, but a huge belief that local government was far less good than they were going to make the civil service be, and I use those words advisedly, and that it needed to be beaten into doing some quite dramatic things, because otherwise public services would be heavy, overweight, full of bad practices which came from her perception, and it wasn't entirely wrong, so hard to argue against, about the way in which trade unions might choose to do things. But also in there is a very interesting for me debate about the confidence in local and national politics. A huge belief by Mrs. Thatcher and her government, to keep this cheerfully in the past, that central government had the political clout to reform the way in which public services were delivered nationally, but a complete lack of belief that any one local government would be able to take that initiative and do it locally. And again, some people did, and there were some huge reforming councils, and some people stuck their heels in and resisted, and the battles of the 80s perhaps don't need to be reversed here. And I think also the other thing that we should not ignore is the change in the sort of zeitgeist, in our expectations about the way you do things. So in the 70s, I worked in a small bakery firm, who if they needed somebody to do something, they employed somebody. This was probably normal in large chunks of British industry and British commerce at the time. You employed your own gardeners, handymen, people to do the laundry, ladies who wheeled tea trolleys around the corridors. We did it across everywhere. Suddenly we started thinking collectively that actually you probably ought to outsource the gardening, the cleaning, and that somebody, rather than paying somebody full-time to do something that patently wasn't a full-time job, to keep it in micro scale, it was better to get a firm in to do it as and when you needed it. And suddenly that world of greater flexibility and greater greater concern for that became live. And alongside it, I think in local government in particular, a concern about the quality of services. And I think probably my final point here is to say, we all remember recent panorama exposés about the quality of residential care. But I certainly remember sitting through a number of similar exposés 20 or 30 years ago about the quality of local authority care and the way in which some local authorities were warehousing and looking after elderly people, and the fact that there was a real lack in standards because they weren't being properly monitored from outside. Now so at that point we started to believe that only the private sector could do it. We're now starting to ask ourselves whether the public sector perhaps should step in and do some of those things, or regulate them better, or manage them better. So for me there is a constant debate about how you drive up quality, and actually a question about whether or not the market adds to quality, or whether there is a cyclical question here, which is partly about the quality of the contracts, the way in which we let them, the managing that we do, and actually the reality of our expectations on both sides of that public-private divide about what is achievable for the money that we've got, and what is achievable in terms of the change agenda that is bound to be coming towards us, which I still think bedevils some of our conversations today. So I will stop there, Nick, if I may, and I hope I've lobbed a few thoughts at you about those slightly sort of more broader thematic things that have driven where we are today.
That's great. Thank you very much. Rod, successes and failures on the way.
It's great to be here, by the way, but I think just to sort of start from the front here, these views are my own, they're not the views of Capita, okay? All right? What I would say is that local government has been probably the most innovative sector to work in, and it has at least tackled the problems head on, whereas central government has not. And I think that is a very disappointing situation, but it's real. However, I think the power of my industry, and I'm talking more white collar than anything, I think is untapped. I don't think it's been used in the right way, and I'm not saying that that's local government's fault. I think it's as much the industry's fault, because there are some pretty real facts here that we have unlocked a lot of inefficiency in local government, and by innovation and change of services, which frankly at this time when budgets are tight, you can't simply go on cutting. You've got to actually rethink how those services can be delivered. And the great thing about my industry is that it's not about a consultant's brain where they provide the information and then go. It then is a brain that has to then deliver contractually what it actually wants to bring about innovation. We have wasted so much time and energy in the period that you look on this screen here in arguing about public versus private. And it was a way of deflecting what the real issues were. Because people who didn't want to do things were given evidence about why they shouldn't do it, without facts. And this industry has had to spend a lot of time in justifying its existence. It is a myth that people that are transferred from the public to the private sector have had a bad show. They haven't. I can tell you that a lot of people who have done that journey would not want to go back. They have better career prospects, they have investment in them, and generally speaking they are at the front of an organisation that wants to do something good, than rather being in the back office, which is really where I specialised. But it took so much time to get to that point that we've lost a lot of that energy and a lot of that possibility, and as a result we're not where we should be. And when you look at the problems now with budgets, I feel that the partnership working that I think is important, and definition of partnership has changed. Thatcher did us a favour in many ways because at least she opened our minds to alternatives. What she did, however, was to destroy the relationship between those that wanted to provide services in-house and those that could do it externally. And that has been something which had to be repaired over a very long time, and you still sense that that is the case. What I've learnt is, to make this work, you needed to find a political leader that wanted to do something. You had to find a chief executive that was up for doing it, because they created the space for you to come in and to be very innovative. We started small, we then became larger in the services that we could provide, and you were given the confidence to actually do that by that leadership. We got to a point with Capita that we wouldn't bid unless we saw political leadership of that nature, and it's not common, and that is a problem. The shared services agenda has been a disgrace. It has been missed completely, and I feel that it should have been forced by government, because the waste of common services across my sector, if you take council tax collection, is one I always use, is just beyond belief. It's unsupportable. And if the public knew what it costs to provide these services and how much cheaper that they could be provided through shared services centres, I think the level of accountability for local councillors would be quite different. And I think government missed a trick on that. So we've come a long way. I mean, when you see that sort of 28-year journey, it is an amazing journey in its own right. But you look at the penetration of what I think this industry could have given to you, is much lower. Procurement has become complicated unnecessarily, and it's being complicated by people who don't always want to add value. They sometimes just want to make value for themselves. And I think there's a lot that can be going for it. But I am enormously proud of what has been achieved. I think public services and my sector have moved on dramatically. I think there are problems. And I think my industry, and I just talk about the sector, I don't think the sector has been bright. We took a long time to get ourselves in order across this barrage, and in many ways the CBI provided us a home for that. I think some of the companies have acted irresponsibly. They've taken contracts because they want contracts, and they've been prepared to take them at prices where, frankly, you can't deliver them. Equally, I think the other side has been less open at the beginning. We were given problems, and we were not told the facts. We were then given service levels that were way surpassed what you were taking over, and then how to account for doing it. We became wise to that, and what we did was we did an audit of what we were being asked to be taken over. Some of the backlogs that we were given in certain areas were actually disgraceful. So, you know, we've learned a lot as an industry. I feel there's a lot more to go, and as you can probably gather, I'm delighted to be part of the history, but I also want to be part of the future, because I think there's a lot more that this sector can bring. Thank you.
Great, Rod. Thanks very much. Caroline.
Thank you. I was specifically asked to look at what the successes were in overcoming the barriers that have been highlighted. I have worked very largely in local government throughout my career, and my first senior management positions were actually in charge of what was called DSOs in those days. So I was a DSO manager and under compulsory competitive tendering. And actually I think some of the history that I gained was how not to manage contracts in the way that was crudely done, through crude service specification and very crude contract management, through what was called a client-contractor split between the policy and specification and those who deliver. And that was actually really quite atrocious. And I might say from my 3 years in Whitehall, I actually think that Whitehall's still in that place in separating policy and delivery very crudely, and really need to move into the space which local government got to after a very short period of time, realising that that very crude split does not work at all. I had responsibility in the first instance for managing leisure centres, swimming baths and school meals. And when the education officer comes along and measures and weighs the size and weight of a pizza that you are serving to children, you realise that you've got it wrong in terms of the relationship between the specifier and the deliverer of that contract. So I think one of the barriers that was overcome actually was many people in local government who sat and worked in local government being managed inappropriately within that CCT environment, who came to understand that the way in which to outsource and to manage contracts appropriately was through a partnership approach and a clear understanding of the flexibility and the profit that somebody has to generate to make those contracts work. And I think at one point there was an absolute reluctance and resistance to the private sector making a profit out of the public sector. So I think that worked particularly well in areas around environmental services, which I also had responsibility for delivering as well. What helped with the outsourcing was actually when Labour came in, and I don't quite recognise the Labour councils who were so much in favour of private sector provision, certainly from the ones that I worked for. But what did help considerably with the move with private sector contracts was TUPE. Legislation does help, actually, in these environments. So TUPE and pensions, that was a major step forward in moving work into the private sector. I think another major success was around regulation, not very popular for somebody in local government, certainly not in my position now, to say that regulation was helpful, but actually the Audit Commission did move through best value indicators, which came completely stupid and bizarre, I agree. But in the first instance, that whole issue of cost, quality, benchmarking definitely did shift the mindset of local government managers and indeed politicians to think about alternative ways of delivering service. So regulation and legislation, I do believe, were helpful. I think areas where it hasn't gone quite so well, frankly, and I would put adult social care, and I'll put that in context. Actually, local government has been fantastically successful at managing the costs of adult social care in an environment where the budgets have been decreasing and the demographics have been increasing exponentially. I think they've done a fantastic job, we have. However, and I say this myself as a public service manager, making a profit out of vulnerable people actually feels quite difficult, and that whole concept. And I think local government has driven such a hard bargain in this area, actually, in terms of the service costs, to keep those costs down, that actually I think Helen raised the issue as, have we gone too far? And we do need to understand that people do need to make a profit to be able to provide quality as well. So I think that's a real issue that we need to think about going forward. I thought it would be useful just to talk about European legislation, because that's always used in terms of procurement, of the issues that prevent people. A barrier can be overcome. You can commission service design and procure contracts within European legislation that is done in a way that allows you to procure local services from local people. And I'd use an example of what we did in Shropshire, where on the school's meal service, we actually got to the point where we dictated, believe it or not, the menus that would be provided in schools, so that the produce was local produce, locally grown, locally cooked. And so we service specified in a way that meant that local SMEs got that work, not large food processors, that the quality of school meals that went up, that the cost was appropriate because we took out transport costs, and the wider social objectives of the council were achieved whilst outsourcing a lot of that work into SMEs. And I would see that as a way forward where the wider social objectives of a local area can be achieved. And I think it's just useful to finish by saying that typically 60% of all council services are now delivered by SMEs. And I think it's just worth remembering that. That's a national. There will be people where it is virtually zero, and there will be people where it is 90%. But across the local government sector, it is typically 60%, and I think that is a cause for celebration and success.
Great. Caroline, thanks very much indeed. When you want to join in, raise a hand, say who you are, and I'll bring you in. There's sort of, I always find thinking about this in the local government context difficult, because it's more complicated than it is in other areas. And there's kind of two types of service, aren't there? There's the what you might call the back office stuff, which clearly impinges on the public in terms of the service you get. It's not a service to people, whereas social care, healthcare, welfare to work are all services that are directly to clients, for want of a better word. And is that a false distinction, or is that a real one? And to pick up Caroline's point about people feeling uncomfortable about profits, this has huge debate around health, where clearly there's a chunk of the country that thinks making profit out of healthcare is wrong. Any of you want to pick that up? You were grimacing, as I said.
I was grimacing, not because I think it's intrinsically wrong, but I think it's a dangerous divide.
Yeah.
Because I think most services are slightly more complex than that seems. So take a classic social work team. There's a bunch of people who are out there interfacing with vulnerable people. The management work is partly scheduling and rostering them. It's partly supervision, which is essential to their professional quality, and which is something that Princess Munro and others have talked about as being essential to good service. What of that is back office and front office? They're doing a lot of their own record keeping as they go around. They used not to. They used to come back and write it all up and spend, it's like the same as police officers. To what extent is that a back office service, or to what extent is good documentation a part of good professional practice? Now, the point of raising all of that is that in some of our attempts to separate the two things, we've drawn very crude lines and said, okay, we'll take all of the admin out and we'll give that to somebody else to manage, and we'll leave the professional staff to do their job, and then cause them to do more of their own admin and driven up the cost of the service in ways that we hadn't foreseen. So my grimace wasn't to say you're wrong, it was to say beware of a crude divide, because sometimes it is just a little too simplistic.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably Rod's point about you have to change the service fundamentally rather than simply slicing across it.
Yep. I'm going to have a microphone over there.
Thank you, John from the County Councils Network, but assume I'm speaking in a personal capacity unless I say otherwise. Nick, I think there's one specific context relevant to this debate where the distinction you raise is a very relevant one, because what we've mainly talked about, the useful, interesting things that the panel have said, is the kind of block contracting out model that's been the trend of the last 30 years. The trend that's been more recent is of the individual service procurement, so the personalisation and choice agenda, which is also market-driven, because it is, here is a service level, now that's what it costs, go out and procure what you as an individual want for that money, or at least tailor the service. Now, question there, is that a countercurrent to block outsourcing? Because it's quite difficult to manage a market both saying, here is a large contract that we can get an economy of scale out of, and each individual has to procure. Now, that is much more relevant to certain services. So you can say, here is how much it was costing to provide an elderly person with social care. Elderly person can have that money to get what most suits them. You can't really say, here's £300, resurface the road outside your house as easily. And if I can just tack on a specific kind of personal hobby horse to that, how are both block outsourcing markets, but in particular the choice and personalisation type of market, managed in very rural areas where you don't necessarily, for a lot of services, have a diversity of private sector suppliers?
Anyone instinctively want to pick that up?
I'm very happy to do that, having managed probably the most rural council in the country. Where you actually, the whole issue of developing markets is extremely different. Well, the only large private sector provider you have in your county is a German yoghurt factory. It is very difficult to actually develop some of those markets, and to get people to bring them in when you're very sparsely populated, low population, is actually extraordinarily difficult, because actually the private sector will not come in without a premium price being attached. So there are some real challenges, I think, to some of that personalisation agenda. However, where adult social care is concerned, I think there are so many smaller private providers that actually that whole, and whilst we did purchase in block contracts in the past to get the prices and the costs down, I do think that there are sufficient providers currently to enable that personalisation agenda to go forward, even in the most sparsely populated parts of the country. I mean, just whilst we're on that, on some of these block contracts, and I think it's worth thinking a little bit about some of those issues where the cartels have arrived, and particularly going into rural communities as well. Privatisation of bus transport in rural areas, in my view, is not a great success. And the deregulation of that service has allowed very large monopolies to sweep up in those areas, and councils are now paying well over the odds of the price of some of those services.
Just coming on to that, I've been wondering quite a lot about the conundrum you posed at the beginning, because it seems to me that what's going to happen is that we give people the cost of what it costs to provide them now. When that is purchased, whether directly from their own resources by councils with large purchasing power and large employment, or by their contractors. So if you put it really simply, if your care is costing you £10 an hour on current provision, will you be able to purchase that in the local marketplace for £10 an hour? Or will you, if you're given £100 worth of it, get much less for your £100? I think there's a real risk that you might in some places, and that those markets will be hugely different. So what then does the council do? And I think this is the interesting question for me going forward, because councils ought to be advisors and assessors of elderly people around social care. They're providers of budgets. The other thing that might change in that market is also co-payment. So maybe people have access to funds put in by their families to buy things. Maybe they become greater regulators, because some of the things that people buy won't be the things that we've regulated to date, and that will present a conundrum. Or might they also act as agents? So might you say, in some place where you didn't think there was enough local provision, I'm going to buy in X thousand hours of care at a price that I can get it for, and sell it on at only very marginally more to those vulnerable people, because that price is still a lot lower than they could buy it in the local market, and guarantee some continuity of employment to people wanting to work in that sector. But whatever of those things you choose to do, one or more of them, you're going to change the market fundamentally. And I mean, I don't think there's a right answer, but I think there's a real conundrum to be engaged with as we move into this world.
Yeah, I mean, there are undoubtedly two kinds of, I mean, I did glancingly refer to this. I mean, today we're really here to talk about what we've all talked about to some extent, which is how local government can use the private sector or the voluntary sector, or buy services in from them in order to deliver its services more efficiently, more effectively, whatever. But of course there is an entirely separate, well not entirely, but a kind of different wing of thought, which is what we need is quasi-markets. And this is completely different, kind of, it's not different entirely, but the idea is that you have the public sector, but people effectively carry vouchers or now personalised budgets in order to use quasi-market pressure to make bad hospitals better, bad schools better, all of the logic that fell out of the local management of school reforms that really triggered all of this and which have now spread. Now, of course, they have something in common with private sector being, or public sector getting competitive contracting in order to deliver services that are better at a lower price, in that they're both somehow marketized, but they're kind of different versions of using a market. And managing the two together is not necessarily just not going to work. I mean, they are different things. And you mentioned economies of scale. Well, you know, that's another strand of efficiency interest, which is different from these two. And I'm afraid, you know, this is, you know, Britain is a fertile place for interesting policies dropped down from on high and then pushed through the system, and they all live on together. Well, like housing policy, you know, it's like archaeology. You can see 14 governments' policies all backed up against each other. It's a bit like that, really.
I just comment on myself, that I've always had a suspicion with the personalisation and choice budget with social care, you know, where it is means tested and do allow top-ups. The more you go down that road, actually, the easier it is to cut the budget, I suspect, because you're sort of picking off individuals one by one, rather than announcing that, you know, we're going to close down some whole swathe of service. And at the time when money is tight, I think it'd be quite interesting to see what happens to the value of those budgets. I think they're picked off a different way. Sorry, let me.
Nick Sharman. I'm just really interested in the sense of going back to the market, the way markets have been created in local government is around the existing services that have been very separate. And you've got a private market that has developed around the provision of those services. The challenge now, surely, is a much broader one, that we want outcomes, we want joined up services. So we actually have a market totally unprepared for that. Equally, we have commissioners who have been equally trapped in providing a road service, a tarmac service, or an adult social care, not how to improve the lot of older people in the community. So to me, there is a major change that we are not in at the moment a very good position to confront in terms of the structure of the market. And I suppose that leads me to say, crucial to this, and I'm picking up on Rod's point about the poisonous legacy of CCT and the distrust between the provider and the commissioner over the period. We're not seeing people actually debate and think, how can we both commission differently, and then how can we develop a supply market that is willing to take on the breadth of service that you need to create outcomes. And we don't have a supply market that's capable of doing that. And I suppose the interest I've got to the panel is, how can we help create that dialogue way ahead of the procurement process, in which we can debate new ways of working. And then those of us who are involved in the private sector can go back to our boards and say, this is worth investing in, because there's a real concern at the moment about the risk attached to the local government market by boards, and whether they're willing to invest the time and effort into it. So I think we've got a history that is very difficult to now confront the emerging challenges.
But in a sense, if you look at history and move forward, it happened because people were prepared to have conversations. And people have got to feel that those conversations can be valued and will come to something. I think the problem you've now got, so going back again, in saying my sense of Capita was quite flexible about what it was prepared to do, because it wanted to find a way through something. I think you've now got, in my industry, I think you've got people who are quite polarised in what they are prepared to do and won't enter into some of the more innovative thinkings. I mean, if you think of the market, you've now got two very large players who are quite entrenched, I feel, and I hold this, I've said this publicly, and I think now there are new models that have got to be worked out which will encourage people to have those conversations. I mean, the mutual model is something which an outsourcer doesn't naturally want, fine, but actually, if you got some of the organisations, some of the services you're talking about into a structure where you could have a conversations about how they would play a part, employers will play a part in it, the organisation will play a part in it, and the provider comes along and is creative and innovative, has re-engineering capability, has ICT capability, that is a very powerful partnership. But to seduce somebody in to do that, you've got to believe that there's going to be a market that's going to be created, because otherwise the industry doesn't do it as it stands. So I think there needs to be new players in this industry. So I think the markets and the areas you're talking about will create those new players, and that's what's good.
Rod, when we were talking outside a bit further, you said outsourcing is dead.
No, I didn't say outsourcing is dead. I said in the form that it has been, that the contracts have been let, I think it's had its day. I think it's proved its point. I think there was many good examples, and there have been problems, but they've been resolved. Going forward, I think the circumstances are different. Out of what has been done with Capita, you created a public company. 80% of the staff who work in that public company come from the public sector. All right? There's absolutely no reason, therefore, why given staff in the public sector used in the right way, with the right incentives and the right belief, that they could not do something very similar. And I think people have woken up to that. So why should you simply outsource and think that then everything's going to be all right? Because it's not going to be all right. How do you partner? What is this word partnership? It's got to be more meaningful. And I think some of these either joint ventures or mutuals at least give you a feel where you can have a board where you've got other people represented. Unions can be on it. What's to hide? I mean, what we found was, in the end, unions were with us. People wanted people to outsource things to Capita with the unions fund because they knew they were safe. I'm sorry, but I mean, that's the point. So I have no fear about unions. What I want is a structure where I can be innovative and creative and know where my objectives are going and my vision is. So it's got to move on.
Anyone else want to pick up that theme?
I was going to say, just on that point, just developing it, there are some councils, and I would quote one, Sunderland City Council is doing some fantastic work in setting up mutuals. Now, Sunderland is not a council which you would immediately think of as not providing direct service provision, but they are doing some really good work in terms of setting up mutuals, particularly in adult social care, as a mechanism of getting completely different kind of service provision, innovation and cost savings. I think one of the issues that I think it's worth us talking about, if we are learning from history, is the number of time councils have outsourced a problem. And all that is just a transfer of a problem. And it's just a nightmare that you can no longer manage yourselves and control yourselves. And it was really good for me to hear Rod, say that that's not something that Capita would do, because too many people, too many councils have been keen to say, this is a problem, I can't deal with it anymore, out it goes. And too many private sector organisations have been too keen just to say, yes, we'll have it, we'll sort it out. And actually, you've just got a really arm's length problem.
You haven't made no mistakes, by the way.
Well, everybody does, don't they? We all do.
Yeah.
Okay. Christina Dykes, I'm an associate of the Institute of Government. I'd like to move on and talking about, so it's adjunct to the question before, to what is going to come next with the Open Services White Paper, particularly which I looked at this afternoon. It seems to be raising expectations that the delivery of services are going to be to the consumer's expectation. Words like quality, not price, payment by results, compete on fair terms. So I sort of putting it to the panel, is central government deliberately raising expectations on what local government can deliver without giving local government all the means to do it? And where is the public being set up to be the arbiters and the dictators of these services, when in realities we all know perhaps these services can't be delivered to those high expectations?
Anyone would like to pick that one up?
So yes.
Yep.
I mean, I'm sure this is another, this is one of this government's ways of yet again trying to apply pressure on local government to improve. I mean, i.e., create expectations, pressures. It's a kind of, again, it's a first cousin of choice of schools or choice of hospitals. Create demand, and demand will make public services better. It will make them perform more effectively. I'm sure that's what that's all about. It will, I mean, in theory, I mean, the Open Public Services White Paper and the ideas behind it would, if people really took advantage of some of the proposals in it, create enormous expectations. What I'm not so certain about is whether people really do want to sort of leave their TVs on damp November evenings in order to create local committees to go and put pressure on public services to improve. I think they just want them to improve. I'm not sure they want to go through the setting up the committees on the damp November evenings bit.
We have a microphone there, and then
Sue Thompson.
Toby Eccles from Social Finance. I was just wanting to return a bit to this theme that what we're looking at is trying to work on transformation in order to reduce costs and improve services. That sort of transformation requires detailed partnership working. And in the work that we've been doing with local authorities around social impact bonds and similar type of models, you've got an enormous amount of work to do in partnership, but somewhere you've got to then procure a service developed with that intellectual property, and no one's quite sure how to fit that partnership working with the procurement process. And I was just wondering whether the panel had any comment on whether there is a route through that, or whether the procurement process is going to consistently put a sort of line through the middle of it, making it actually very difficult for that sort of transformation to be done in that sort of partnership way.
Helen.
I think there must be a route through it, but I think it's complicated. And I think your question, Toby, is connected with Nick's question about outcome bases and how you create complex partnerships around complex services. And I just have two or three thoughts. And the first is about politics and change, because the more time you invest in creating the outcomes you now think that are desirable, which inevitably, because you're creating them now, you won't deliver them into the future, the bigger the risk is from change, whether that's change imposed by central government or change wished upon by local politicians. And what's the right balance there, I don't know. The second is that conversation about risk. I mean, it seems to me the other thing that's changing in the local world of local government at the moment is that we're being encouraged to think about risk in a different kind of way. So you can look at financing mechanisms like TIF, like New Homes Bonus. You're being encouraged to kind of take a risk on what the future will bring and invest money in advance of that. And yet at the same time, what transparency mitigates is against taking huge risks with public money. It's kind of an interesting conundrum. And then the third bit in all of that, it seems to me, is how you have really open and honest dialogues about means, objectives, ends, profit and what the problem is. I mean, Carolyn talked about people having a problem outsourced. Very often, it seems to me that there is an incentive not to be 100% honest, or even to be able to describe what it is like to do business in the public sector when you're talking to people who've never done it. And that's something about policy change, that's something about the nature of political risk, that's something about the nature of expectation, which is what we were just talking about. But the converse is also true. When I talk to people who are in competition with each other in bits of the private sector market, they're often tracking each other's share prices on their iPhones while they chat to me. You know, oh yeah, my competitor's gone down 3 and he's gone up 2, and they know what the driving forces of their competitors are. In the public sector, we very often don't, and we're not always honest the other way around when we're doing business. So we don't always entirely understand what the drivers of our private sector partners are. So some small bit of innovative business that was 3% of national turnover for a big company might suddenly, because one of their other markets collapses, become 20% of their turnover. Suddenly becomes vastly interesting to their board, and the fact that you were only getting a very small return on investment suddenly becomes an untenable proposition when it had been a perfectly tenable one at the point you signed the contract. And it seems to me that some of those real honesty about expectation in the long term, are boards bought into it? Do people understand what it's like to do business in a complex political environment? We've all taken for granted because we all know our own worlds, but we don't know the other guys.
I think, just picking that up again, I think from the sort of private sector side, the earlier you choose your partner in a procurement process, the better. So you need to understand about your partner and the characteristics, what they believe in, and etc. Whereas the procurement process generally tries to keep you apart, and it tries to keep as many in the ring as you possibly can for as long as you can. And to do the sort of things that you're talking about, which is incredibly innovative, you've got to have the feeling that you're going to be engaged, because a lot of the issues that emerged were where you weren't engaged. You were just given things which turned out to be inaccurate. I think just to hit this profit bit up front, there's nothing wrong with profit. It's how profit is used. If profit is invested in a business that can then do other things, there's nothing wrong with it. And too much time is focused on, if you take Capita, for example, I always said, we made 12% profit. We saved the customer 20 to 30%. So let's talk about 40% inefficiency, right? Let's talk about 40% efficiency, not about 10% or 12% profit. And let's analyse how Capita can make that, all right? They make it because some of the things they do, they put into shared services centres, and they run them from one place. Local government has refused to do that. So all the industry or the private sector is doing is the sensible thing, all right? Now, should you share in that is a very interesting comment, but the local government has not had the courage to go out and put that together and then to get the benefit from it. So profit is not, I see your point about share prices. I tell you, it's not fun reporting every 6 months. It's not fun having to go through some of the issues that you have on a bad contract in the public and seeing it reported, and you've got shareholders you've got to actually stand up and be accounted for. It's not a doddle, and therefore we need to feel like you're a real partner, not that I'm a contractor. I want to be with you, not sat beneath you. That's the thing.
So, the profit issue is, I think, terrifically difficult. I agree with what Rod has said entirely. I suspect most people in the room would accept exactly that proposition. I think the difficulty is that it's never put in that elegant way, and certainly not by the trades unions when it comes to putting it publicly, because it will always be put as, well, this company is making 7% profit on running our school, that money could be spent in the school. And that is the discourse, that is the way it is put in public discourse. And, this, I think, all goes back to the culture war starting point. If you look at the way the Thatcher government went about all of this, it was about breaking the unions, destroying the public sector. Therefore, that's how it all began. And it's never fully escaped that. And I'm endlessly fascinated myself by the fact that all over Europe there are mutually and privately delivered health care systems, which we all think are marvellous, which in this country would all be seen as privatised. And yet, oddly, they work really well. Nobody worries about the profits. It's just Britain. And why a country that is in many ways as entrepreneurial as it is also has this bizarre attitude to profits made by companies that deliver services that are part of the public sector, even if they're better and more efficient than they would be otherwise, still nowhere near sorting that out.
Some of this is culturally determined. And I remember a huge row when I was in Belgium a while back about them privatising their water companies, which we did 20 years ago.
Yeah.
You know, they've had privatised healthcare. I mean, mixed supply of healthcare for donkeys years. They said that's uncontroversial. Why
Yeah, well,
are
there
you
we are.
fussed
Well, there
about
we are.
it,
Perhaps
you
it's
know?
just where you
But
start.
Water.
Good point. Yes, water.
One there. I'll take two or three together. So could
Yeah,
ask
okay.
the question, can the microphone then go back that way?
Sure. Sue Maddock. It's a fascinating discussion. I just wanted to... I'm working on a research project with a number of other people on public sector procurement and innovation. And I'm doing the case study on the work programme. And it actually is... I mean, one of the things that's coming through, apart from the issues in the press around particular companies, the thing that's coming out very, very clearly is, the way in which the prime contractors are incentivised for results, but it's actually the smaller specialist companies that have the capacity and the experience to deliver working with long-term claimants. And many of them are leaving the programme because they can't afford to go for a year before any results come through, which is one problem. The other problem is enough money being put in the system such that they are allowed to work in a way in which they need to be able to work with disadvantaged people, and that's difficult. But what the message is, and from both specialist and a lot of prime contractors and a part of other people, is that the way to actually secure more a sustainable connection and relationships. And I like what you were saying about, Whitehall still seems to be stuck in the old purchaser-provider split, is that at the locality level, there's a real need to look at the site of commissioning itself. So this is a centrally driven programme where they've spent a bit of time looking at the model of delivery, and it's an amazing amount of money. And the resistance to actually considering locality commission seems great, and I'm interested in your views as to arguments that will make persuasive actually a move towards locality commissioning, and the thoughts of its value, because at the moment the departmentalism between departments and the lack of connection and liaison across central government is undermining the very relationships that I'm sure you know all this. I'm just interested in your views on locality commissioning.
Well, I'll come back and take a question at the back, and then could that microphone come down here, and we'll take three together, and then we'll...
Okay, as a new recruit to local government, this is a really fascinating area, and I work for a county
Say who
council.
you are.
Oh, my name is Vincenzo Rampul. I work for Oxfordshire County Council. This is very much a personal question. Given that the future holds an incredible scale, widening of the scale of this type of work, and the complexity and interrelations between different services, I'm conscious that the political accountability still sits with councils. From the public point of view, perception, their services are still, the councils are going to be answerable to them. So I'm interested in the panel's views of both from the private sector and from colleagues who've worked in local government. Where should a council seek to position itself to balance that viewpoint of, one, it's responsible for the quality and the outcome of those services, and yet it's got a very different relationship with the people who are actually delivering those services, and the money's coming from somewhere completely different.
Right. Graham, and you take that as John Tizard.
John Tizard, picking up on that point, actually, it's a very useful hook to introduce what I wanted to say, because I think we've moved between privatisation and outsourcing here. But it seems to me that if what we're talking about is not privatisation, it's contracting, it's partnering, it's outsourcing, where the ultimate responsibility rests with the council, and the council specifies either the outcome or the output that it desires, the amount of money it's willing to spend, and holds the provider to account. In my mind, privatisation, you may have some regulatory control, but it's actually the transfer of the asset and much greater freedom to the provider. And it seems to me, again, we've got to be very careful. We don't use the right language. We play in, we allow the wrong debate to take place. I think going back and looking at some of the history, for me, one of the interesting things is that there's been no consistent reason why the public sector generally, and local government specifically, has turned to the private sector. In some cases, it's been because it's believed that was a way of reducing cost and expenditure. In other areas, it's been to get innovation and service improvement, sometimes a combination. Sometimes it's been as part of an economic regeneration program. Private sector partners been brought in to deliver services and create a number of additional new jobs in a locality. Sometimes, it's, as Caroline has said, it's been to sort out a problem which has been ducked or avoided internally. Sometimes it's been for innovation and for choice. And it seems to be, again, we have that confusion. Do the panel feel that there's a risk now that because of the financial pressures, most of the local authorities that are looking to use the private sector are looking for cost reduction rather than innovation and change? And how do we move to where Nick wants to be, and I want to be, and many others do, where we're having a real debate about how we get the best from both to get tomorrow's services rather than yesterday's service, potentially at a cheaper price?
Right, accountancy commissioning. Subcontractors. Who would like to sort of pick up on some of that?
I don't mind doing some of that. I mean, and just coming back to John's point, which I think is absolutely correct, actually, that you know, we do need to get the language right, and it is really about outsourcing, contracting, etc., without a doubt. And also, the other reason why sometimes that has happened is because not just about wanting to make efficiency and saving, but to get appropriate levels of capital investment, which the council itself doesn't have, and those tie you into very long contracts, which perhaps some councils then regret. So I just think we've got to get ourselves into the place of partnering and very much thinking about that whole issue of how we partner to provide services, whether those be held in-house. And I think this is an issue about political accountability that Vincenzo just referred to, the whole issue of political accountability. I don't understand, to be honest, why it is so massively different to be politically accountable for a service which is provided by X or by your own staff. I know that people love providing services by their own staff because then you can get involved in the day-to-day control issues, but actually that whole issue about political accountability to your local community in relation to quality and cost, and so I personally think is the same, and it just requires a few different political skills which we need to work on, and politicians, I think, have always adapted to the agendas that are put in front of them. I think they're the most fantastic individuals in terms of making that adaptation, and they will do it, no question. So I don't have a problem. And Sue, the point you make about the work programme, etc., and local commissioning, and it's very tempting to sit here and say we told you so, but indeed we did. I do think that whole issue about central control and commissioning of services which are should be entirely responsive and local to local communities and local economic circumstances. You know, you just hope one day we do learn the lesson to really trust, to let go a little more. And maybe that's about central government and local government partnering as well, some of the commissioning, because we never have that conversation either. It's either you or us, and the fences come down. So I do think it's about the public sector being better at working together, whether it be central or local government or other parts of the public sector, and about us all working in partnership, really.
I mean, the sort of vision, you know, that I've always had is that I've really sort of thought about us as being almost like a specialist. We're very good at some things. We wouldn't do things we're not good at. And therefore, when you become that way, you have a lot of experience, you have a lot of infrastructure, and you're quite a useful partner to somebody who needs to go through the things that you are good at. And I think the trouble we've had is to get that point over where if you're not good at something, get the hell out of it because you shouldn't be doing it, and give it to somebody who is. And the glue is to have the relationship that enables you to have those conversations not on a forced basis around a contract, but on a regular, ongoing basis. I mean, I think that, you know, the project manager or whatever of a contract should be on the senior officers board of the local authority or whatever the senior leadership team is. I think it has to be as close as that and not seen as us and them. And we've come from a history of us and them. The question at the back about, you know, when we first started, people I mean, we had an influence contract around housing benefits, and I won't name the local authority, but they just wanted to say that Capita were providing it because it was such a bloody mess that, frankly, they wanted just to pass it over. What is quite interesting, Capita's still working for that local authority 15 years later, but the beginning of it was horrific. And, you know, that is not the way to act. You know, as individuals, let alone being, you know, commercially as a company, it's not where you want to be. So it's really, I think, a time now where people have got to open their minds to what's possible, frankly, and not be... And I think local government is very, very good at this. I don't think central government does it very well at all. And you've had to structure those things in central government. I don't know about health. I wouldn't comment, but as much.
Tony?
Right. I mean, on the political account, many of the things we're discussing this evening clearly affect, or are likely to affect, accountability in the sense that you've got an array of providers, but through outsourcing, in the end, or however it's done, the council, if it's a council service, broadly remains answerable for what is done and delivered. I think the real challenge comes in those services where I'd be hard pushed myself to describe accountability of our councillors are accountable. I mean, schools, I'm not sure I could any longer give you a particularly well thought through answer. Who is accountable for schools in England? Councillors are when things go wrong, I get that bit, and have to intervene, but not in a way that anybody notices, so that's complicated. I mean, and the way the school system is evolving, I think is provides clear evidence for something that I think councillors need to make clear, in a sense, what they are accountable for in what's left of local government, and where they're gaining new responsibilities, for example, over public health, make sure people understand that. So I do think there's a duty on local government itself to explain where accountability lies with it and how far it goes, because it is complicated.
Yeah. Anything you wanted to pick up on that? Or?
I suppose I don't want to kind of take up too much more time, but two things really, because it sometimes seems to me that in some of these debates about what constitutes the right thing to do, there becomes an orthodoxy. I remember having a conversation with somebody when the social value bill was going through, and they were saying, so local authorities will have to behave in a certain kind of way, because that will demonstrate they're thinking about social value. And you think, well, actually, social value is something, you know, this is before the Act was passed. It's something you could define in a whole bunch of different ways, and isn't that the process of politics, to say what's of value to your community and what it is we're going to prioritise in some of these transactions? That's the first thing. The second thing is I'm very sympathetic to a lot of what Rob says, but some of our learned experience in local government is the difficulty of getting rid of contracts that have ceased to work for us, or which never actually did in the first place, whether our fault or the contractors. I too have had experience of housing benefit contracts that didn't work and frankly got exponentially worse when outsourcing had to be brought back in-house. Those are scarring and juddering experiences. And so one of the questions it seems to me that we need to come back to when we're thinking about the partnering relationships is how you dissolve them. I mean, it's the sort of prenup question, isn't it? How is it when things go wrong, you're going to be able to get out of this without completely damaging what it is you've done together and spending the rest of your life in the courts and spending a shed load of public money to no good effect whatsoever? And it seems to me that that is also one of the things that we have to think creatively about going forward. Because only when you feel that you've both got some skin in the game and some weight to control this and some ability to say, hang on, this doesn't work for me anymore, do you feel that you're in a partnership which you've chosen to be in as opposed to an arrangement that you sort of find yourself having to make the best of? And I don't quite know how you do that, because the way we structure things at the moment, not the intention of the private sector, but the way we structure things. The best thing you say there is, frankly, if it's very difficult for you, it's very difficult sat the other side of it. And frankly, you've got to have those grown-up conversations.
And I think, therefore, it comes back to sometimes the way that the structuring of the vehicle or whatever it is, where you can have those honest and open conversations, and that's really what you've got to get to. It's not comfortable to carry on with something that's not working, which is what worries me about the industry, where people have taken contracts at low prices, where frankly they haven't got the capacity in the contract to be able to put in investment if there's backlogs or other things. And you can't go on doing that. Can you?
I mean, two thoughts based around that, Rob. The first is that it just strikes me that in the post-Chupi world, it shouldn't have been possible to make a lot of money unless you were doing innovation. Because in the pre-Chupi world, one could argue you could change terms and conditions and that would solve the problem. So we ought to be, I mean, I agree with you, Robert. I mean, we ought to be working together on what that innovation is, and too often we're not. The slight negative point is that very often when the margins have been tight, the other thing we've done is to extend the length of the contract, so that rather than giving people the opportunity to change what they do and to make their margin early, we've said, well, fine, in 15, 20 years' time it will be fine, so I'll sign here for 15, 20 years, because the exigencies of the current financial situation drive me as a local authority to do that, and actually drive the private sector to agree that's a good idea, even though on both sides of the table you're crossing your fingers and everything else, and knowing full well this is damn stupid. But it is probably the only thing we can do right now. And I think, you know, being honest about some of those kinds of things, coming right back to where I started, is hugely difficult, but probably vitally necessary.
And to come back to the welfare to work point, essentially, you're trying to do two additional things there, aren't you? Because in a sense, the welfare to work contracts are almost a kind of a PFI, in that you're trying to get the private sector to fund the service you are providing up front and only get paid afterwards. And that creates a completely different dynamic within the relationship between both the purchaser of the DWP and the subcontractors of the companies. And so, you know, I mean, it looks, you know, it's early days, but it sounds like it's going to be. But it's kind of built, you know, despite the Merlin Agreement and all that, it seems to be sort of built into the nature of the thing, because you are trying to do something in addition to outsourcing your thing. You're actually trying to get it funded up front. And that requires, you know, deep pockets and...
But to be fair to central government on troubled families, a similar concept, that whole discussion that CLG had with ourselves and with local government was absolutely about, if you want this to be successful, this has got to be upfront funding, and local government will have to take the longer term risk. So you government push the funding in up front, and we will take the longer term risk for the savings going forward. And that came out of a true and proper partnership discussion. So we can do it, and that's just a poor example of where actually people were not listening and not talking constructively, to be honest.
Sorry, the reason I asked the question is actually I'm really interested in, because it's going to central government, so anything that's an illustration of how to build that possibility of a conversation towards a trajectory of central government, or particularly on that DWP, at least listening to that argument is what I'm thinking.
Well, I think they too will have be feeling that experience as well, and indeed are, and therefore I'm sure we're all able to move. I would hope we would all be able to move forward in a much more constructive manner.
Right. Well, I think I'm rapidly reaching the stage where I'm standing between you all and a glass of wine and a glass of orange juice or whatever. So I won't try and sum it up unless anyone's got a burning question to ask at the end. I think we'll stop there. And can I please ask you to well, first of all, thank you very much for coming. Please to thank your panel for stimulating